So you wrote an interesting story about blind tennis. Tell us about that.
Who who would think there was such a thing as blind tennis, right? I didn't, but I was I learned about it from a friend of a friend of a friend, which is how stories often happen. And her mother was doing blind tennis. She'd been had a varied professional career and started to lose her eyesight. And she had to give up her house and the thousands of books she'd had in her house. She'd been an avid reader. And she was at a program at the Metropolitan Museum in New York on seeing through drawing. It's a program for people, visually impaired people, to try to enable them to appreciate the collection that they met. So already this is something I love because it's not recognizing these limitations that people think we have. And someone said, you should really try blind tennis. And she's like, yeah, I want to know more. Tell me more. Never played tennis in her life, never been interested in athletics. But the idea that she didn't have to say that she was somebody who couldn't play tennis because of her uh, uh, impairment in her vision.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to 45 Forward. This is Ron Roel, your host. Talked to you today with John Leland, a New York Times reporter who's been at the Times for 25 years. I last had John on my show about 2 years ago when we talked about his best-selling book, Happiness is a Choice You Make, about the daily lives of several New Yorkers 85 and older. It's a remarkably insightful, somewhat surprising book about aging. And ever since then, I wanted to ask John back to return to 45 Forward and talk about his success stories about aging and his thoughts on longevity and really living a purposeful life all the way through. So John has a lot to say about this subject, and I'm delighted to have him back. John, welcome to the show.
So great to be here.
So John, as I mentioned, so you've written a lot of things. You cover the texture of today's life, from youth culture to the lives of the very old. I want to talk about, a little bit about a story you wrote, I think it was the end of last year, because that had an interesting twist to it. It's about a man who decided to get bar mitzvah, but not at the age of 13, but rather at the age of 90. So talk a little bit about the story, how you found the story, a little bit about the man, and some of what you thought about the story and what you thought about him.
Well, it's not something you encounter every day. The man's name was Ron Roel, and he had been a popular folk singer in Israel, or what was then called Palestine, and then in the United States became kind of a fixture in the Greenwich Village folk scene. And very, very popular. He was 90 years old. But if we do the math and take us back 77 years to when he was 13, it was 1947. The area we're talking about was then a British mandate called Palestine, and it was in turmoil. And as his 13th birthday approached, his parents did what parents do. They bought the food, they ordered the food, they invited the guests, and then the British government called the curfew because of the unrest. And so they're there at home, they've got the food, but nobody can cook, so nobody could go out. And so he never had a bar mitzvah, and he never missed this, but over the years, he was a singer, so anytime a relative had a bar mitzvah, he sang at it. When his kid had a bar mitzvah, he sang at it. When his brother had a bar mitzvah, he sang at it. But he'd never had one himself. And as his 90th birthday approached, his brother thought, now's really the time to do it. Because we never know, right? So they invited about the same number of guests, about 75 guests, to a steakhouse in Manhattan. It was December, I believe, so there were Christmas decorations on the walls, and they were I think they were a very culturally Jewish family, but not a very religious Jewish family. So there was steak and there was shrimp side by side, which you might not have at a kosher a bar mitzvah. And, you know, you've been to bar mitzvahs over your life. And one of the things that are so wonderful about them is that they're multi-generational events, of which we have too few. And usually the bar mitzvah boy is the young generation, and the other people are the older generation. But now when the bar mitzvah boy is 90, we could have it, he could be represent the older generation, and there could be, his son was there, and there were, great nephews and great nieces, wives, ex-wives, other ex-wives. It was a wonderful celebration of community that he was able to do. And, his brother got his band there, and they performed. And the Israeli consul in New York sang a duet with him.
Wow. So they didn't hoist him in a chair, though.
No, they did not hoist him in a chair. We could have, though. There was dancing. There was everything you would expect of a bar mitzvah. And I don't know why we didn't hoist him in a chair. The bar mitzvah is the celebration of life, right? It's a celebration of entering manhood, but like the other things, they're the celebration of life. And we're there with people a lot of times that we haven't seen in years. We always say we're going to see them more often, and we don't. And there's always people there. We don't know whether we'll ever see them again. And it was a chance to do it, and including, people who had come from Israel for this, who may thought they would never see Ron again, and they got to see him. So it was a great celebration.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting because it really, at 13, we were celebrating becoming a man. But at 90, you're also celebrating having been one and survived, and you're still there. And it's just sort of an interesting twist on life, And you and I've talked a lot about sort of what longevity offers is kind of a disruption of the traditional timetable of, events in our life. And so this is a very interesting twist. And in some ways, I don't want to say it's more meaningful, but it's a different kind of meaning.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. I think, what does it mean to become a man means something at 13, when it's speculative. And what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a member of this community, a contributing member who's ready to take my place in this community in a different way than I did, when I was a child? And so I think that meant a lot to him. And also just having the people there who come to be a part of his life. And I think when you're 13, these are the people that you hope are going to be part of your life going on forever. And now you see that at 90, you see if some of them aren't there anymore. Some of the people you thought would make this journey with you aren't there. But you can value the people that are there and not take it for granted that they were going to be there for the rest of your life. So there's a different perspective on it that he was able to share with the people there, and maybe they could discuss and understand and share with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And certainly, when when you're 13, it's mostly your family and I guess some of your, adolescent friends, but now you have friends from many periods, hopefully, of your life. So it's a different kind of experience. It's kind of more enriching. I mean, I got married, not bar mitzvah, but I got married, relatively late, early 40s. And that wedding was quite different from when if I'd been, say, 23. I mean, it was a very different mixture of friends and family, and already from several stages of my life. So it really is more enriching. So I think that this is interesting. Now, is Ron still with us?
He is, as far as I know, and still performing, and he's still in good voice. He might not do the complicated tours that he once did, but he still performs. And to this event, I talked to a friend of mine who's going to be 95 in November. And I said, David, and David had been a fixture in the Greenwich Village folk scene as well. So I said, David, do you know Ron Elleron? And he had this bar mitzvah. And he said, really? I'm having a bar mitzvah too. For a slightly different reason. His family was in D.C., I think, at the time when he was 13. but they didn't have the money to be part of a temple. So he had never had one. And he thought like, or somebody had thought, well, David's done so much, and he really is somebody who'd done a lot in his life. But he'd never had a bar mitzvah. He'd never had this ritual. And he came from a long tradition of rabbis. So it was a missing element in his life. Not sure that he really felt it as a missing element until it was brought up. But he's somebody who will never miss an opportunity for a celebration. So they had his bar mitzvah at, I think he was 93 at the time.
You and I've talked about this. So the markers in our life have been changing, and this is one of the, implications of longevity is that we can really stretch things out and change the markers around. Um, so one of the things, I mean, one of your earlier stories was about, I think it was called The Secret Lives of Seniors Who Don't Want to Stop Working. So that's, another, one of the elements is that we have, much longer spans of life, but perhaps not. There's no need to work in the same kind of traditional way, right? We can, we could go to school, we go to college, we get married, we have a career, and we work until we retire, and then, that's it. We do something else. But this, the longevity gives us an opportunity to disrupt this kind of pattern.
Yes, I mean, for centuries, human beings worked mostly in agriculture, right? And it was backbreaking work. And you could do it, and you would do it and do it and do it till you dropped. And when we started to work in slightly different fields and created the idea of retirement, it was the idea that work would wear you out. We would be digging up stumps or working in assembly lines. We'd be doing physically draining work that we couldn't do all our lives. And in fairness, a lot of people still do that. We have a lot of, you think of our nurses who have to be on their feet, for 12-hour shifts. One can't do that always after a certain age. That gets to be more, or people can do it, but it gets challenging after a certain age. But now a lot of us, not all of us, but a lot of us work in fields where it's not physically draining, where our experience is worth something, and maybe that calendar doesn't really work as well as it used to. Maybe we don't need to get all our education by the time we're 18 or 22 or 25 or 26, and then go into the workplace and try to make as much money as we can while we can, and have children and get out of the workplace to have children or work for having children. Maybe maybe our education should be a lifelong thing, and we'll work a bit and get our education for a bit, and maybe we don't need to work so much when we're raising our children. Maybe, we skip those years from when we're 30 to 35, but work when we're 65 to 70, move those 5 years later. These are just thoughts. Everybody would have a different plan for this. For some people that scenario that didn't work, but other people would have, a more radical disruption of their ideas, of their timeline. And we as a society, not as individuals, but as a culture, haven't really rethought that calendar for, as it's existed for centuries. But we are living differently, and we're living longer than we were. When Social Security was instituted, people couldn't work much past 65, and they didn't live much past 65. There was a lower life expectancy. But now we're going to live another 15, 20, 25, 30 years after 65. So how do we make those years productive? And why do we think of them as the period of time after we're like contributing members to society?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that there's lots of rationale to kind of break it up. Because certainly, we don't, certainly I didn't have, a physically demanding job. I was a writer and journalist like you. And I still am. I'm just not not working for one employer. But I think the longevity gives us a chance to, um, recognize we will have a longer overall period, but we can break it up. So, I mean, you could be working in a job for, 10 years and you're not physically drained, but emotionally, you may be like, well, okay, that's enough. There's no reason why you should keep doing that and continuing on that trajectory. I think there's a lot of rationale for taking, what might be considered sort of a semi, a small sabbatical. We do it in some professions, right? In the teaching professions and the ministries. Um, and it's not supposed to be pretty where we just said, okay, we'll just take a break and go on vacation. Some people do go and take some vacation time, but it's really a time to kind of rethink, to pivot and say, well, where am I? What do I want to do? Um, do I want to continue along this path? Maybe I do, but not right. Let me just, take some time to reorient myself. Um, I had a little bit of this, when I was at, an editor at Newsday, and then we had our two sons a little bit later, and then it's like, well, I do need to take a parental leave. Taking care of twins and my wife is like, no, this is not on her alone. Um, and it did give me, you come back and you're like, you're different. Certainly when you have kids, you're different, and your priorities change. But it seems like that's an opportunity we don't take advantage of. And I think sometimes it's on us and sometimes it's on the employer. And I think there is sort of an assumption if you do have that kind of, checkerboard career or just breaks like that, that maybe you're not quite as serious as the guy next to you about advancing in your company. But I think that the enrichment that's possible really greatly outweighs the lockstep advancement. So, but it's hard.
It is hard. And I have hopes for the generation after us, because we're about the same age, I think, uh, who, you know, aren't working for companies for life. They're not in that long-term profession. And often they're not in the same profession for life because the jobs are changing around. So they need to be more nimble. And I'm I'm just optimistic that they will start to rethink that calendar, because I'll work this I'll work this job for 5 years, and then maybe I need to go back to school and do a little different kind of training and work this other field for 10, 15 years and then do something else, as opposed to, I think most of you and I work in the field that we're in for 30, 40 years.
Yeah. I think that, certainly, having worked in journalism, there is an opportunity to shift a little bit because you can just, take on different beat. And then, yes, you're still writing, but it takes you into a different area. So I think that's important to change your perspective. It's easy to get caught in, one view. And I think that's what, I think you started talking about, sort of education. And I think that, there is, this possibility for lifelong learning in a really broad perspective. And it can be going back to school, getting different kinds of credentials. Um, I I'm gonna have someone on the show in a few weeks who was an attorney. Actually, she was a judge, and then she retired, and now she started a jewelry business. I mean, something completely different. But I think that, and even when I think, I'm not going to say that education is wasted on the young. It's not. It's just again, it's a different education. You're, is a religious education. Getting the bar mitzvah is different. 13 and 90, and as you get the same kind of education, if you had it at 40, 45 instead of 25, be a different experience too. You know, you know things and look at things in ways you just couldn't do when you were younger, and I think we miss that opportunity.
I think we do. And of course, if your kids are the age that I think they are, then you're paying for their education now, or you recently paid for education. And you know that that's just implausible for a lot of families to pay for that 4-year education when your kids are 18, 19, and there's nothing coming back. And maybe, and it's the payoff from it isn't what it once was. So maybe it's do a little technical training at 18, 19. Uh, work on your soul a little bit in your 30s, work on something else in your 40s. There's an opportunity there just not to do things a certain way just because we used to do it a certain way.
Right. Yeah, I think that certainly, the issue of the cost of college education comes into it, where people are, they're burdened with a lot of student debt, and then there's no job. So that's a concern for people, and then perhaps that kind of college education is not for everybody. Um, Certainly not. But at the same time, I do, I had sort of a classical liberal arts education, where I said, well, this is my time, okay, yes, I'm fortunate we could afford it, but it also was a time to explore things in broad ways that I don't know if I don't have it again. So I said, well, let me do this. And I think we're sort of missing that in education today. We're going, well, why are we learning all this? This has no relevance to anything. And well, in some ways you don't, but sometimes you don't know what the relevance is. You're too young to know what relevance is.
Well, the broad-based liberal arts education has become a smaller part of the college experience. It involves fewer students, a smaller share of the student body in the East. I have to say that I've had the great opportunity to speak at a couple of the lifetime learning institutions, and where the students are older, and it has been wonderful. They come, you're in this class, and there's a lawyer, and there's a scientist, and there's a retired general, and there's somebody else, and they made the point to continue their education in areas where they might have expertise or might have no expertise. A lot of the people are professionally accomplished, but they put themselves in an environment where they're not the experts anymore. And I think it takes a certain amount of courage to do that, but there's great value in it.
I think so. Yeah. So you need to have a dose of humility. Like, okay, you know, just like when you go through school, you're a freshman, then you're a senior, then start over again in college as a freshman. Um, but I think that people do appreciate it. And having gone to a number of college reunions, some of my classmates, in talking with them, there, you have opportunities to take, listen to lectures from, various professors, and they would say like, "Wow, I miss that. I miss just that exploration." You're so focused on pragmatic living, getting things done, dealing with your kids, taking care of day-to-day pragmatics. You don't have a chance to expand your mind, and I think that's something, again, that um, that that lifelong learning offers an opportunity. I had I'm a member of this group called Peer, which is affiliated with a local college here in Long Island. I think it stands for Personal Enrichment in Retirement. So people are, by and large, retired who join this group, but it's a group in which people actually teach each other. That you take on a subject, and maybe, as you mentioned, you know something about it, maybe know nothing about it, but you learn about it, and then you have to teach it to your peers, and so it does become in part, educational, in part social. Everyone is older, and so you're looking for social engagement. So it brings back both the educational and social aspects of learning.
That sounds great.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And actually, there have been a couple of marriages that have come out of it. um, at any rate, so listen, I just wanted to shift a little bit. So, in terms of breaking up we're talking about breaking up those kinds of milestones. One of the things you and I have talked about too is just sort of breaking up of traditional ways to act. Different. You don't need to act your age in certain ways, and I think that, there people today are different in that respect.
Oh, it's the worst idea that we should act our age, isn't it? That we should act well. We should act well in the society. But this idea that you should behave a certain way 13 in a different way at 43 and a different way at 83. Dress a different way at 13 and 43 and 83. I think this limits us in so many ways. Why shouldn't we? Why do we have to be age appropriate all the time? Why do we have to say, oh no, I can't wear that skirt because I'm too old to wear that skirt or that jacket as well? It's why not? You know, we look in the mirror, we wanted to wear that skirt because we imagined ourselves in that skirt. We were able to see ourselves in that skirt and saw something we liked. Now, if we're wearing that skirt to try to make us feel younger than we are, I might have an issue with that. I think we should embrace our age rather than try to hide it. But if we're wearing that skirt because we think we look fantastic in that skirt, and damn it, we want to show off our legs a little bit, you know, go for it. You've earned those legs, whatever they look like. You know, those weren't easy. So wear that and do the things you want to do. You want to go to that bar and people are younger than you? Go to that bar. Don't 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 let the fear that you're the old guy or the old gal at the bar stop you from going there. Take up hobbies that are for young people. Take up to do things that you never thought you would do. So, carve a soapbox derby. I don't care. Like,
Right, right. Yeah.
Get your Boy Scout certificate. And
All right. Great. Get that merit badge. It's still there. That's great. So listen, I'm going to just take a quick break, John. So folks, we are going to take a short break, but we'll be coming right back and talking much more with John Leland of the New York Times. So don't go anywhere.
Are you caring for an aging loved one? It can feel overwhelming, but you don't have to do it alone. Ron's book, The Caregiving Navigator, is a step-by-step guide designed to help you plan, prepare, and provide compassionate care with confidence. From organizing family conversations to navigating long-term care and finding support for yourself, the caregiver, it's all here. Find The Caregiving Navigator now on Amazon and take the first step toward peace of mind.
Welcome back to 45 Forward, folks. We're talking today with John Leland, a longtime reporter for the New York Times and author of Happiness is a Choice We Make, which we'll talk about a little bit more, just sort of updating the book and letting people know about it if they haven't already seen my previous podcast on it. I want to shift a little bit now to, issues of aging and longevity and how that sort of intersects with, technology and accessibility, because there are opportunities that we have now, over a longer life to do things that previously weren't possible. So you wrote an interesting story about blind tennis. Tell us about that.
who who would think there was such a thing as blind tennis, right? I didn't, but I learned about it from a friend of a friend of a friend, which is how stories often happen. And her mother was doing blind tennis. She'd been had a varied professional career and started to lose her eyesight. And she had to give up her house and the thousands of books she'd had in her house. She'd been an avid reader. And she was at a program at the Metropolitan Museum in New York on seeing through drawing. It's a program for people, visually impaired people, to try to enable them to appreciate the collection that they met. So already this is something I love because it's not recognizing these limitations that people think we have. And someone said, you should really try blind tennis. And she's like, yeah, I want to know more. Tell me more. Never played tennis in her life, never been interested in athletics. But the idea that she didn't have to say that she was somebody who couldn't play tennis because of her uh, impairment in her vision, but she could learn to play. So there was a program in Lower Manhattan in the financial district called Sound of Tennis that taught tennis to people with different levels of vision impairment. Some could sort of see a ball. Some were they were all, I guess, legally blind. But some people had more vision than others. Some had no vision of the ball at all, and they could only follow it through sound. And they would get out there every Saturday morning, get themselves to this club in the basement in the financial district, which was itself a challenge for anyone who has experience with accessoride or paratransit in New York City, which is often called stressoride. So they said that this was the great challenge of the place, because the building had doors on three sides. So they never knew, when they gave the accessoride driver the address, they never knew exactly where they would be dropped off. So they had to figure out where they were and then ditto on the way home. They didn't know what driver was going to pick them up. So there was already a challenge before they got there. And as I said, some of the players really couldn't see at all. And so the instructor would kind of throw the ball towards their racket and say, okay, now push. And they would hit the ball. And sometimes they would make contact and sometimes they wouldn't. And the woman that had led me into the story, she ended up not playing when I was there because she had fallen and hurt her shoulder. But her daughter said to her after, you could never schedule anything on a Saturday with her because she was so in love with the tennis lesson. But his daughter would say, Mom, how was tennis today? What did you hit? Who did you hit? Sometimes she'd say, well, I hit the ball. And sometimes she'd say, oh, I hit the instructor. So it was just part of the thing. But it gave her something. It was just a lesson to all of us that there are these things we think we can't do. And we can do a lot of them. Not in the ways that we would totally imagine ourselves in our fantasies of doing them, but that's no reason for us not to do that.
Right, right. And this gives us that opportunity. I think that one of the things that I've been looking at, and I do a lot of things that deal with how to age, what I call aging successfully. And there is a lot of intersection with with physical challenges as we get older. So there's a overlap in terms of um, needs for people who are older and those for people who are frail and elderly and have somewhat of a disability in that sense. Um, and I think that we miss the opportunity to recognize what we can learn about how to age well by those who are dealing with certain disabilities. Certainly as we age, vision is an issue, hearing is an issue. I have some of these things. And one of the things I loved about your book, of happy is a choice you make, is that you dealt with people who were 85 and older. And, it wasn't easy for them, but they just lived and they accepted these challenges. And I think that, and not only now can we not just accept them, but we can do something about them. There are technologies that can really enrich our lives, much longer than previously.
Well, one of the, my book is also, the subtitle of it is Lessons from a Year Among the Oldest Old. And it was really about the lessons that I learned from that. And one of the most important and early lessons that I got, I said, they all had things that they lost. They'd all had things that they couldn't do that they used to do. But none of them define themselves by that loss. Only other people define them that way. Maybe it was their doctors, maybe their kids who said, Mom can't walk like she used to, and that was Mom, and she sometimes forgets things. She doesn't have the memory she used to have. Instead of thinking that, geez, Mom did a great job with her plants today, or Dad had a really thoughtful conversation today. And I think that's something that we can learn from people who, let's face it, are experts at loss at a certain point, dealt with it enough. They've lost, maybe a lot of the people that I talked to, because they were over 85, a lot of them had lost spouses. They'd certainly all lost parents, of course. And they were they were experts in that. They'd lost some of their mobility. They'd lost their memory. They'd lost some of their eyesight. Not all of it in the cases of the people that I dealt with, although in the case of mobility, some lost more than others. And they get up every morning and say, like, life isn't what I've lost. Life is what I can do. That's what defines me. That's who I am. Just as it did when I was 17 and couldn't do some of the things I did when I was 15.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of life that's enriching, um, that's informs you in ways that you couldn't appreciate when you were younger. Certainly, you talked a lot in the book about the issue of gratitude for what you have as opposed to what you've lost. And one of my colleagues coined this term. I haven't heard it except from her, and I think you know this person, Vicky Eller, who has also interviewed you. And that is, we talk about as we get older, and somebody who looks, good at, or, physically strong and adept as they get older, we say, or they look at them and you call it, even so, let's say you're in your 70s and you look like you're in your 50s, supposedly, and you say, well, that person is really ageless. And she says, well, why don't we change the term to ageful? And embracing our age. We are full of our age, whatever age that is, as opposed to, defining it as you don't age. We do age.
Also, I don't like the idea that if people are 80 something and they're not frail, we say, oh, you seem really young, because then it seems that the young is not frail and old is frail. Old isn't frail. There are people that are frail when they're older. There's people who are not frail when they're older. There's people who are frail when they're younger, and there's people who are not frail when they're younger. Frail is frail. Old is old. Those are different things. Sharp is sharp. Cognitive decline is cognitive decline. That's not aging. So it might have an age-related component to it, but that's not what 80 looks like. 80 looks like everything. 80 looks like, Gloria Steinem, and it looks like your uncle who's not getting around.
And I think there are actually cases where people, will say if they start taking care of themselves in different ways when they're 65, I do know some people say, well, I'm in better shape now than when I was 45, and they literally are, so, so let's, let me just have a little bit of a reprise for people who weren't familiar with what you did with Happiness is a Choice You Make. You just describe that story a little bit, what you did with that.
So it was a life-changing experience for me, which was the last thing I expected. It began with a year-long series in the New York Times. I just thought I would follow 6 people over the age of 85 for a year and see where their life took them. And I thought, well, this is going to be, again, I thought this would be a tale of loss. And somebody's going to lose their hearing and their life would go down. Somebody's going to lose part of their memory and their life's going to go down. Someone's going to fall and break a hip or become less mobile and their life's going to go down. And what I found over the course of the year is sort of what I said before, is that the people had a lot of the problems that I expected, but those weren't the governing factors in their lives. Their lives were elsewhere. Their lives were their time with their children, or their time caring for their plants, or their cantankerous relationships with their neighbors, or whatever they might be, or their romantic involvement, because one of the people had was in a couple with somebody she met in a nursing home. So it was following them for a year, and then when the year was over, I was supposed to be done with them, and I found that something was missing from my life. I didn't know what it was. What was it? What was missing from my life? And it was what I was learning day to day from spending time with people who were experts in living, who had lived a life, lived lives, and knew things that I didn't know. And that might be historical periods, or it might have been, wisdom. I don't like to think that older people are necessarily wise, because they're not. A dumb old person is probably a dumb young person who got old. But there was something I missed. I started to explore that, and I thought I needed to get back in their lives. And I thought I would write a book about the lessons I learned from them. And I ended up following them in the Times and partly in the book, but less so in the book, but in the Times until the end of their lives. All
Yeah, and you say so. It changed you. I think that we don't. As journalists, I think there is a certain sense of objectivity. You want to be um, observe, but it does change you. I mean, you are participants, even if you're. And I think that actually, um, I had someone on my show last week about she did surveys of voters. She did a book called Our Common Ground, which you can listen to on my podcast as well. But so she said that in talking with voters, the tradition is, well, you don't get involved with them, but in fact, she did get involved in relationships with them, and in fact, by doing so, she felt that they were actually more honest with her about what they really believed and who they voted for and did not vote for and why. And I think that some of that to me is a lesson about um, writing about people that you're not intimately involved with them, but you're in a relationship that you can really understand their lives, and they can really open up to you, and provide stories that otherwise your readers wouldn't have. And I think that's what one of the things I do appreciate about your writing, John, is that you're an eloquent writer, and there's a certain warmth of that. A lot of writing today seems sort of acerbic, and yours is objective, but also involved and respectful of your subject. And I think that comes out in your writing.
well, I think we owe that to the people. I asked a lot, in this series in the Times and in the book, I asked a lot of people. I asked a lot of them, asked them to let me into their lives. And it's a really important part of their lives. And in parts of their lives where maybe they felt vulnerable, maybe they felt mortal in ways that they were not necessarily comfortable with. Uh, or they felt that there was things that they didn't do and maybe they had regrets. I asked them to share that with me. So I felt you had to honor that. And I over the course of my work life, I've often written about people who went through terrible experiences. And I felt like I don't have to live that experience with them, but I really have to honor it. I have to take into account what it's like and respect it. And so I try to do that with anybody I write about. I think we all should. And most people do. I find that there's that kind of snarky stuff is very loud. So we might think that it's more of the journalism world than it is. And it attracts us. It's like a shiny little thing. So we might be drawn to that. Think of like my colleagues who review restaurants. They know that panning a restaurant is going to get a zillion views, and saying, "Oh, the steak was really quite good there," is not like it's not going to work the same way. So, uh, that's what we deal with. But we can always treat people with respect. And I came to realize that these people had given me so much, and it really it helped me appreciate my mother, because I was in my mid-50s then. My mother was in her mid-80s, and I would see my mother regularly. She was living in a building for older adults in Manhattan, and uh, I would think about the things I could do for her, but I never thought about what she was giving me. And maybe I thought of the things that she'd given me when I was growing up, but I thought that period of time was over. Now it was my time. And I realized that what I was getting from these people who you know, were strangers to me, or just people I knew from the journalism world, were giving me so much, and helped me appreciate what I was getting from my mother. And so, our get-togethers were less, "What can I do for mom?" than, "Oh, let's have a great lunch date." It just changed it.
In the last part of our show, before we conclude, I wanted to talk a little bit more about just your career as a journalist and just some of your observations about your profession. And a lot of people talk about I feel this to talk about us, but and sometimes I'm a little bit like, well, you don't really know what's happening and what we're thinking. You might think, but both you and I have been through some really big changes in a relatively short time in our profession. When I started out in the late '60s as an intern, we still had what's now known as hot type. Where you would actually men, I think maybe some women, but mostly men, actually getting articles and setting them up and locking them in pages and then sending them off and that there would be 5 editions, and 5-star editions, and people would stay there until I mean, my shift started at 1 in the afternoon, went till 8 at night, and then the people took over. So the profession has really changed a lot. And what are your thoughts about that? I mean, you've been through a lot of those changes too.
Well, I have, and I think that the change that troubles me the most is the loss of local press.
Ah,
Since the advent of Craigslist, which killed classified ads for newspapers,
right.
which a lot of smaller papers relied upon. The New York Times, fortunately, doesn't, but a lot of papers did. And a lot of communities have lost their local news. And so I think it's made it easier for people who are criticized in the news to say the news is horrible, the press is terrible. Because now when you think about the press, it's somebody far away. It's not the neighbors who were reporting, we're going to that, town council meeting and reporting back on what happened there because you don't have the time to do that. You're too busy. So I think that diminution of the local press, that idea that the newspaper guy, the people writing your story, or the people who live next door, has really made it possible for people to demonize the press in ways they do. And I think probably we've fallen and we've made mistakes and we've contributed to the low reputation we have now. But we do have a low reputation now, and we need to be mindful of that. At the same time, I look at my news organization. We do stories that are happening right now, right this second. It's a new thing. When I started there, pictures were only in black and white. And if you wanted to read about the planes that hit the World Trade Center on September 11th, you would read about them on September 12th. Now you would read about it 10 minutes later. And it involves an entirely new level of competitiveness, but it also gives people information immediately. And that immediacy has its ups and downs.
Right. Yeah, I think your last comment is really germane, that there are ups and downs. Certainly, you want information as quickly as possible, especially in crises and disasters. But often the first accounts are not correct or are first drafts, and that's not in fact what happened. And I think that's one of the unfortunate things about that. Those first impressions stick, and that sometimes it's hard to change. Like that's not what happened. I'll just, one example that came up recently that was, and again, I think it's the immediacy of being able to go on, podcasts or, a TV show or blog or something, again, can alter things in ways that are unfortunate. So there was an incident where I guess it got a lot of views. So there was a game, a Philadelphia Phillies game, which I don't know, you probably know this. There was a scene in the crowd where I don't know if it was a foul ball. It was a ball that was hit into the stands, and the scene you see is that a man takes the ball and he goes over and he gives it to his son. I presume it's his son. The son likes it, and he says, "This is great." And then you see a woman come over and confront him, and they have a short argument, and he gives her the ball. And the observations of people who talked about it, the sports pundits, whoever said, "Can you look? That's a Philadelphia fan grabbing the ball, from a kid, And in fact, what happened, if you dug a little deeper and watched the whole thing, spent a little time, you'd realize that she was upset because the ball was hit in her section. It was right in front of her. And this guy from the section over came over and grabbed the ball, basically depriving it from people who were legitimately in that section. The ball was there. So, but now this woman, I'm sure no one ever saw that and was like, look at that Philly fan, boy, oh boy. And so that's, I think the unfortunate thing is the immediacy also does not allow us for reflection and for, thoughtfulness. And again, to your stories, they're thoughtful. You think about them, you spend time with them. So, your writing reminds me of a lot of thoughtful writers in my canon of people like Joseph Mitchell, and Bill Zinzer, and some of them, are the, the new journalists of their age. But I think they're basically, they took the time to really explore things. And I think that's the piece of journalism I like to, keep in there.
I hope so. I'm not worthy to be considered that company, but I am very fortunate that I get time to work these stories I do, and I get editors who have time to edit them, and we think about what it is we're saying, and do we need to go back to this person and see, did they really say what we think they said? Was that the important thing here, or was there something more important that we're missing? And get a chance to go back to the interviews and think, did I get that right? Instead of looking at it in print the next day and saying, you didn't get that right.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So this hour has gone quickly. We could do a whole other, yeah. Any last thoughts, John, about what you'd like to do going forward?
It's what I like to do. I'm 65, or I'm sorry, I'm 66, as my son had to remind me the other day. I can do what I do. And there's things that other people can do that I cannot do that well. I'm not a digital native, and I'm never going to be a digital native. So there's certain digital skills that I probably could learn, but I might not. But there's certain things that I can do that some of my colleagues that can do things that I can't do. And it's a wonderful thing to be able to go out there and meet interesting people. And some of them are 90 and some of them are 30 or 20 or 17. It's just a tremendous gift that I'm given. And I get to share it with like a really, like as you do with your podcast, get to share it with a really wonderful community who sometimes show how wonderful they are in their feedback.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one thing, I'll just mention this before we close, but I do think that's, some of us, print natives, sort of lament the digital quality that's, a lot of us like to hold things in our hands and read them. But that's one thing that I do appreciate about, well, in your case, the New York Times digital edition, which I get in, which is that you do get opportunity to engage your readers in much more immediate ways. And I like reading the articles and then the comments, some of which are aren't the usual kind of self-righteous comment, but there's a lot of interesting information about it and a lot of interesting engagement. So I think we should embrace the digital age in terms of how it can enrich print. So that's what I'm going to try to do.
All right.
Okay. So anyway, so listen, John, thank you for a very thoughtful and thought-provoking conversation. If people have questions or comments, they want to get in touch with you or read more about you, how would they do that?
It's my last name, Leland, at nytimes.com. And I'm always happy to hear from people.
And I think if correct me if I'm wrong, so I think that if people go to nytimes.com/by/John-Leland, they can see some of your stories. They can look at the archive of your stories.
I have to take your word for it. That's the code you need to put in, but yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you just Google it, you can find it as well. But I mean, there is a way that they can, and that's what I've done the last few days, and I've enjoyed it. So, at any rate, Once again, folks, this is Ron Roel, 45 Forward. Thank you for spending this hour with me. If you have questions for me, you can email me at ron@45forward.org. Send me questions, comments about the show, sign up for my monthly newsletter, or just tell me what you think. So until next week, folks, keep moving forward, 45 Forward.